In this video, we are going to examine the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's criticism of the moral values of Western civilization, and why he regarded them as opposed to life itself. Nietzsche was concerned with the problem of morality as if it were a riddle. He said, "To see and to demonstrate the problem of morality is a new principal task." He denied that this had been done by any philosopher prior to himself. Where the other philosophers failed at this task was that they had already fallen under the spell of morality before they had even started their investigation. To investigate morality requires a distrustfulness of the seductiveness of its beautiful gestures and glances. In The Will to Power, he writes, "These are the demands I make upon you, however ill they may sound to you, that you should undertake a critique of the moral evaluations themselves, that you should call a halt to the moral impulse which here demands submission, and not a critique with the question, why submission? That you should regard this demand for a wherefore, for a critique of morality, as precisely your present form of morality, as the sublimest form of morality which does honor to you and to your age. Formerly one said of every morality, by their fruits ye shall know them. However, Nietzsche says of every morality, it is a fruit by which I recognize the soil from which it sprang." There are two main ways of escaping this question of why submission, which he recognized in the philosophies of Kant and Hegel. Kant's response was to dispute the intellect's right to make or reject interpretations of this kind. These types content themselves with an increase in their trust and faith, while renouncing all provability in matters of faith. Kant could not find any ultimately justifying sanction for morality, and yet he did not renounce his faith in it. Instead, he assumed an inconceivable and superior ideal, which was a temporary way of dealing with the problem. The Hegelian way out, following in the footsteps of Plato, was in the form of romanticism, in the form of the historical sense. The spirit itself is the self-revealing and self-realizing ideal. This ideal manifests itself in the course of its process of becoming. In the Hegelian way, the ideal is realized throughout human history. All developments in the human spirit are leading to the realization of the ideal. This way, faith is directed into the future where it can worship. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche sums these two up. 1. God is unknowable for us, and not demonstrable for us, the hidden meaning of the epistemological movement. 2. God is demonstrable, but as something in the process of becoming, and we are part of it, as witness our impulse towards the ideal, the hidden meaning of the historical movement. In both of these interpretations, criticism is never directed at the ideal itself, but only at the problem. The problem being why it hasn't been achieved, and why it can't be demonstrated in small things and in great things. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche called the establishment of moral systems based on a dichotomy of good and evil a calamitous error, and wished to initiate a revaluation of the values of the Christian world. To understand Nietzsche's criticism of morality, we first need to look at his concepts of master morality and slave morality. In his book On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche argues there are two fundamental types of morality: master morality and slave morality. In Western civilization, a fundamental shift took place from thinking in terms of good and bad toward good and evil. The initial form of morality was set by a warrior aristocracy and other ruling castes of ancient civilizations. Aristocratic values of good and bad coincided with and reflected their relationship to lower castes such as slaves. Master morality, as Nietzsche defines it, is a morality of strength and vitality. This strong-willed type of man experiences himself as value-creating. This type judges actions as good or bad based on whether it benefits them and their pursuit of self-defined personal excellence. If something is helpful to the strong-willed type, that is because he sees in it what he values in himself. The noble type values things as good if they aid him in the lifelong process of self-actualization. Other qualities that are often valued in master morality are open-mindedness, courage, truthfulness, trustworthiness, and accurate sense of one's self-worth. The noble man does not need the approval of others. If something is harmful to him, then it is harmful in itself. Goethe represented this kind of valuing when he said, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without augmenting or furthering my activity." Nietzsche presented this master morality as the original system of morality, perhaps best associated with Homeric Greece and the Roman Empire. To be good was to be happy and to have the things related to happiness like wealth, strength, health, and power. To be bad was to be like the slaves over whom the aristocracy ruled, poor, weak, sick, pathetic, objects of pity or disgust rather than hatred. Slave morality developed as a reaction to master morality. These values emerged from the contrast between good and evil, good being associated with otherworldliness, charity, piety, restraint, meekness, and submission, while evil is worldly, cruel, selfish, wealthy, and aggressive. Nietzsche saw slave morality as pessimistic and fearful. Its values emerged to improve the self-perception of slaves. He associated slave morality with the Jewish and Christian traditions. They are born out of the resentment of slaves. Nietzsche argued that the idea of equality allowed slaves to overcome their own conditions without despising themselves. By denying the inherent inequality of people, in success, strength, beauty, and intelligence, for example, slaves acquired a method of escape by generating new values on the basis of rejecting master morality, which frustrated them. It was used to overcome the slave's sense of inferiority before their better-off masters. It does so by making out slave weakness, for example, to be a matter of choice, by relabeling it as meekness. This is what led Nietzsche to say, "All good people are weak. They are good because they are not strong enough to be evil." Slave morality is the inverse of master morality. As such, it is characterized by pessimism and cynicism. The good man of master morality is precisely the evil man of slave morality, while the bad man is recast as the good man. Slave morality does not aim at exerting one's will by strength, but by careful subversion. It does not seek to transcend the masters, but to make them slaves as well. The essence of slave morality is utility. The good is what's most useful for the whole community, not just the strong. Nietzsche sees this as a contradiction. Since the powerful are few compared to the masses of the weak gain power by corrupting the strong into believing that the causes of slavery, like the will to power, are evil, as are the qualities that the weak originally could not choose because of their weakness. By saying humility is voluntary, slave morality avoids admitting that their humility was forced on them by a master. Biblical principles of humility, charity, and pity are the result of universalizing the plight of the slave onto all humankind, and thus enslaving the masters as well. The democratic movement is the heir to Christianity. It is the political manifestation of slave morality because of its obsession with freedom and equality. Democracy is the herd instinct becoming sovereign. Nietzsche did not necessarily believe that everyone should adopt master morality as the be-all, end-all behavior. The eminent Nietzsche scholar Walter Kaufmann rejected this interpretation, writing that Nietzsche's analysis of these two types of morality were used only in a descriptive and historical sense. They were not meant for any kind of acceptance or glorification. But Nietzsche did assert that for the individual, master morality was preferable to slave morality. Nietzsche called master morality a higher order of values, the noble ones, those that say yes to life, those that guarantee the future. Just as there is an order of rank between man and man, there is also an order of rank between morality and morality. Nietzsche waged a philosophic war against the slave morality of Christianity, not with the intention of destroying it, but to put an end to its tyranny. I have declared war on the anemic Christian ideal, together with what is closely related to it, not with the aim of destroying it, but only of putting an end to its tyranny, and clearing the way for new ideals, for more robust ideals. Nietzsche saw in Christianity a morality born of resentment that was antagonistic to life itself. This resentment is a sense of inferiority and jealousy in the face of the privileged, which generates a rejecting and justifying value system. This value system is then used as a means of justifying one's own weaknesses by identifying the source of envy as objectively inferior, serving as a defense mechanism that prevents the resentful individual from addressing and overcoming their insecurities. Resentment occurs in a reflective and passionless age, in which the populace stifles creativity and passion in passionate individuals. In this society, individuals who do not conform to the masses are made scapegoats and objects of ridicule by the masses. This is intended to maintain the status quo and to instill into the masses their own sense of superiority. Every ideal presupposes love and hate, reverence and contempt. Either the positive feeling is the first motive, or the negative feeling is. Hate and contempt are the first motive in all ressentiment ideals. This resentment of slave morality has led to a hatred of life itself, according to Nietzsche. This antithesis is most pronounced in Christian morality. Morality has put under a ban all those instincts that life and growth require. Nietzsche saw this morality as an opposition movement against the efforts of nature to achieve a higher type. My insight: all the forces and drives by virtue of which life and growth exist lie under the ban of morality. Morality as the instinct to deny life. One must destroy morality if one is to liberate life. This tendency of negation or leveling comes from coarse perspectives of utility. A certain species of man is attempting to create conditions that favors his type and all those like him. It is desired to create conditions in which all the advantage would be of the righteous, and the other natures would be discouraged and die out. This is a desire that the most tedious species of man should survive. It is merely a question of taste and of aesthetic. The mistake here, according to Nietzsche, was to make a certain means to life into the standard of life. Instead of placing the standard in the highest enhancement of life, this type has employed the means of their specific type to exclude all others. In other words, to criticize and to select life. Nietzsche said that man has come to love means for their own sake, and forgets that they are means, so they enter his consciousness as aims, or as standards for aims. It is obvious that Nietzsche is looking at morality here through a social Darwinian perspective. Morality is a means for selecting and preserving certain types of human beings. A certain species of man treats the conditions of its existence as conditions which ought to be imposed as a law, as truth, good, perfection. It tyrannizes. Or to put it in the words of William Blake, one law for the lion and ox is oppression. All kinds of imperatives have been implemented to make moral values appear permanent. They've been commanded for so long that they now seem almost instinctive in their commands. Nietzsche criticized the English Darwinists like Herbert Spencer for making moral values into aims of natural evolution. These moral values have revealed themselves within science to be conditions of the existence of society, and are found to be beyond question. It's a consequence of faith and instinct that makes a certain species of man fail to perceive its conditionality, and its relativity to other types, according to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche asks precisely the opposite question. Perhaps desirability lies precisely on the other side. To create conditions in which the righteous man is reduced to the modest position of a useful tool, as the ideal herd animal. Nietzsche continues, perhaps there's never been a more dangerous ideology, a greater mischief in psychology than this will to good. One has read the most repellent type, the unfree man, the bigot. One has taught that only as a bigot is one on the right path to godhood. Only the bigot's way is God's way. Because of his faith in the moral dichotomy of good and evil, the Christian has come to see the world as full of things that must be hated and eternally combated. He hates sin. This good man who is combating evil finds himself surrounded by it. It is in his dreams and desires. So he ends by considering nature and mankind as corrupt. Goodness is an act of grace, making it an impossibility for man. When good is a supreme value, it condemns life. This is why Nietzsche called the Christian God the anemic ideal. The Christian God is a bloodless God because he is the antithesis of life. So Nietzsche calls this ideal a symptom of a diseased and declining life. Therewith he ought to consider his ideology of good and evil as refuted, but one cannot refute an illness, and so he conceives another life. If the righteous were able to destroy evil, then they would no longer have a right to existence, because they would no longer be necessary. The inconsistency of the moralist position, according to Nietzsche, is that while condemning evil, war, or destruction, they do not cease to make war and have enemies. Even here one does not separate the yes from the no. What good is it to hold with all one's strength that war is evil, not to do harm, not to desire to negate? One wages war nonetheless. One cannot do otherwise. The good man who has renounced war in no way ceases to wage war and have enemies. This fact led Nietzsche to say, the idealist is a creature that has good reasons to be in the dark about itself, and is prudent enough to be in the dark about these reasons too. In this section, I will lay out one of Nietzsche's most important observations about morality. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche writes, this treatise deals with the grand politics of virtue. It is intended for the use of those whose interest must lie in learning, not how one becomes virtuous, but how one makes virtuous, how virtue is made to dominate. I intend to prove that to desire the one, the domination of virtue, one must absolutely not desire the other. One automatically renounces becoming virtuous oneself. You achieve the domination of virtue the same way you achieve domination of any kind. This means that if you desire to establish the dominion of virtue, then you must renounce virtue itself. One cannot establish the domination of virtue by means of virtue itself. With virtue itself, one renounces power, loses the will to power. When someone wishes to establish the domination of virtue, they must resort to those very means which it condemns. To introduce a new virtue under the name of an old one requires slandering anything that stands in its way. You exploit advantages and accidents for its glorification and turn followers into fanatics with sacrifice and grand symbolism. Then you excite interest in it by declaring happiness as its consequence and pain as its punishment for disobedience. In other words, victory of any moral ideal uses the same means as any other victory, force, lies, slander, and injustice. One wages war against evil. One believes that war for the sake of goodness does not have the moral consequences or effect on the character that otherwise war brings with it, and owing to which one detests it as evil. In fact, such a war against evil does much more fundamental harm than any kind of hostility of one person against another. In Christian morality, the value of an action depends upon that which preceded it in consciousness. The problem with this interpretation is that the subjective state which preceded it, along with the action itself, is an epiphenomena. According to Nietzsche, all actions, as well as our reasons for them, are secondary byproducts and not the cause of anything. This idea presupposes a free will as cause. The other way an action is judged, according to Nietzsche, is by its consequences, which he recognizes in utilitarianism. This way of determining the value of an action is supposed to circumvent the problem of its origins. This is because to judge it by its origins implies an impossibility, namely knowing its origins. But do we even know its consequences? 4 or 5 steps ahead, perhaps, Nietzsche says. But nobody knows what an action will excite or provoke. For this interpretation to work, we first must know what is useful, beyond 5 steps ahead, of course. Nietzsche says this interpretation of the utilitarians is a misunderstanding of the grand economy, which requires evil. Nietzsche says the concept reprehensible action creates difficulties. Everything is so bound up with everything else that to want to exclude one thing would mean excluding everything. In other words, a reprehensible action means a reprehensible world. So if we don't know the origin and we don't know the consequences, what value does an action possess? The action itself is all that remains, as well as its epiphenomena in consciousness. Consequently, Nietzsche puts forward the question, does the value of an action lie in its subjective epiphenomena? If therefore an action cannot be evaluated neither by its origin, nor by its consequences, nor by its epiphenomena, then its value is X, unknown. Nietzsche goes on to say there are no actions that are good or bad in themselves. An action is good or bad depending on who performs it. One crime can be the greatest privilege in one case and another a stigma. It is the selfishness of the judges that interprets an action according to its usefulness or harmfulness to themselves. Some might want to say that an action is reprehensible because the conscience reprehends it. But Nietzsche says the conscience reprehends an action only because it has been so for a long time. It does not create values. The reason an action is reprehended in the first place because of the insight into or prejudice against its consequences. For belief in morality, one previously needed God as an unconditional sanction with no court of appeal. If one did not believe in God, there was needed a metaphysic of unity to make their morality seem rational. Now that the belief in God has vanished, along with the faith in metaphysics, there's another authority that speaks through morality. This authority comes not from metaphysics, but from animal physiology, according to Nietzsche. What speaks through morality is the herd instinct. It wants to be master. The perspective of the herd will allow value to the individual only from the view of the whole, and for the sake of the whole. It hates those who detach themselves and turns the hatred of all against them. Nietzsche asserted that the whole of European morality is based on what is useful to the herd. This morality is an effect of the herd's will to power. Since the time of Socrates, the common factor in the history of Europe has been to make moral values dominate over all other values. Moral values are desired to be the judge over every endeavor of society, including knowledge and the arts. Improvement according to these moral standards is the sole duty, and everything else must be a means to it. Any hindrance or disturbance is to be combated to the point of annihilation. Nietzsche says there are three causes of this desire for complete submission to morality. The first is the instinct of the herd against the strong and independent. The second is the suffering against the fortunate. And lastly, the mediocre against the exceptional. Nietzsche regarded this submission to morality as slavish. One becomes moral, not because one is moral. Submission to morality can be slavish or resigned, or obtusely enthusiastic, or thoughtless, or an act of desperation, like submission to a prince. In itself, it is nothing moral. The values that are praised by herd morality are fairness, moderate, considerate, trusting, and sympathetic. It also values devotion, generosity, obedience, and disinterestedness. In other words, the perfect values for a slave. Fear and complacency are the motive for these desires. For example, truthfulness is made into a commandment. Behind this commandment is distrust and uneasiness. This is a cause of tension and makes observation and reflection necessary. What this really means is that you should be knowable and recognizable. You shall be knowable, express your inner nature by clear and constant signs, otherwise you are dangerous. And if you are evil, your ability to dissimulate is the worst thing for the herd. We despise the secret and unrecognizable. Consequently, you must consider yourself knowable. You may not be concealed from yourself. You may not believe that you change. Mistrust is the source of truthfulness in the herd. So as not to fear, an attempt is made to love and esteem, and to interpret a disparity in power as a disparity in value, so that the relationship between the slaves and their masters no longer makes them rebellious. In contrast to the herd's gregarious values, those of the imposing class are interpreted as the most evil qualities. The demand for humanization is a tartuffery, behind which a quite definite type of man seeks to attain domination. More exactly, a quite definite instinct, the herd instinct. Human equality, which is concealed behind the tendency to make men more and more alike. All individuals are good according to the standards of society or the herd, as means to the ends of society and the herd, for their preservation and advancement. Thus these values serve as a quite definite purpose, than to create actual conditions of virtue. The moral truths thus one ought to act are merely forms of a consciousness of a tired instinct. Thus and thus one does act among us. It flatters man to be obedient, where he is only an automaton. Many dream of a time when this perfect type will be in the vast majority. Apart from Christianity, this is the ideal of socialism, communism, and collectivism. As a consequence of Christianity, a goal has entered the development of humanity. Progress towards this goal is the only form in which a goal is thought of in history today. After the dissolution of Christianity, that ideal of the kingdom of God has been projected into the future, to be realized on earth and in human form. Nietzsche said those who desire this utopia have held on to the old ideal. This is fundamentally what Nietzsche struggles against. This desire for equality is a leveling down of society. It desires to make men more and more alike. Nietzsche writes, "A virtuous man is a lower species because he is not a person, but acquires his value by conforming to a pattern of man that is fixed once and for all. He can be compared, he has equals, he must not be an individual. Reckon upon the qualities of the good man. Why do they give us pleasure? Because we have no need to fight against them, no need for caution, no marshalling of forces and severity. Our laziness, good nature, frivolity have a good time. It is this pleasant feeling in us that we project out of us and bestow on the good man as a quality, as a value. This tendency of moral development is that everyone desires that no doctrine or valuation should come into favor except that it favors them. The basic tendency of the weak and mediocre is to pull down the stronger by moral judgment. The demand is that we should castrate ourselves from those instincts which make us dangerous and desire power. This idea of humanization, to make man a tame animal, is a misunderstanding of the conditions of existence. It takes good and evil as realities that contradict one another, not as complementary value concepts, which would be the truth. It advises taking the side of the good. It desires that the good should renounce and oppose the evil down to its ultimate roots. It therewith actually denies life. It thinks it will be a state of redemption, going back to wholeness, when the inner anarchy, the inner unrest between those opposing value drives, is at last put an end to. Nietzsche regarded this struggle of morality against the basic instincts of life as the greatest piece of immorality that has ever existed on earth. This will to a single morality is a tyranny over other types. It is a destruction and leveling down for the sake of the ruling type. It seeks to make the others harmless or into useful tools. Nietzsche says the abolition of slavery, supposedly for human dignity, is in fact the destruction of a different type, by undermining its values and happiness. Nietzsche regarded moral judgments as symptomatic of certain inner feelings and dispositions, or affects. They have very little to do with rational deliberation, despite whatever reasons we may ascribe to them. In The Dawn, Nietzsche says these moral feelings are ingrained within us as children, when we observe in adults inclinations for or aversions against certain actions. As primates, we imitate and assimilate these judgments. It's only later that we find ourselves full of acquired and well-exercised affects, and that try to account for and justify them. All virtues are physiological conditions, particularly the principal organic functions considered as necessary, as good. All virtues are really refined passions and enhanced states. Pity and love of mankind as development of the sexual drive, justice as the development of the drive to revenge, virtue as pleasure in resistance, will to power, honor as recognition of the similar and equal in power. According to Nietzsche, there is a different perspectival valuation of events and experiences from our basic drives or instincts. What this means fundamentally is that our sense perceptions are permeated by value judgments. Nietzsche's task was to view and distinguish these moral judgments by the underlying physiological conditions of the organism. Applied to Christian European morality, these symptoms betray signs of failure and decay. They are a mode of interpretation of the same worth as astrology, prompted by the instincts to preserve certain communities, races, or stages of life. In this case, as decline in the stages of life, a sign of decadence and disintegration, effects of a tired instinct that no longer wants to preserve. Applied to the specific Christian European morality, our moral judgments are signs of decline, of disbelief in life, a preparation for pessimism. Nietzsche's revaluation of values was meant to be a reaction against this slow decline. What Nietzsche wanted to preserve was nothing less than the human spirit. And thus spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche conceptualized the type of human being this pessimistic and exhaustive mentality would breed in Europe. The last man is the archetypal passive nihilist, and is the antithesis of the Übermensch. He is tired of life, takes no risks, and only seeks comfort and security. According to Nietzsche, the last man is the goal that modern society and Western civilization has apparently set for themselves. It's a culture which seeks only passive comfort and routine, avoiding everything that could potentially bring risk, pain, or disappointment. Nietzsche warned that the society of the last man could be too barren and decadent to support the growth of healthy human beings. The last man is only possible by having bred an apathetic person, or a society who loses the ability to dream, strive, and who become unwilling to take risks. In this kind of society, people are led to believe that great human beings are great only because they do not seek their own advantage. The value of a man increases in proportion as he denies himself. In the case of the Christian moral perspective, all the passions and desires are the cause of great misfortune, and so they should be extinguished. This is the same logic as, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. The great founder of Christianity recommended this practice to his disciples. In the case of sexual excitation, the consequence is, unfortunately, not only the loss of an organ, but the emasculation of a man's character. And the same applies to the moralist madness that demands, instead of restraining of the passions, their extirpation. Its conclusion is always, only the castrated man is a good man. Nietzsche criticized this view by saying the passions should be mastered instead. Instead of taking into service these great sources of strength that are considered so dangerous and economizing them, this short-sighted and pernicious mode of thought wants to make them dry up. This is fundamentally Nietzsche's rejection of Christ and his Dionysian self as a contrast. Moral intolerance is an expression of weakness in a man. He is afraid of his own immorality. He must deny his strongest drives because he does not yet know how to employ them. Thus, the most fruitful regions of the earth remain uncultivated the longest. The force is lacking that could here become master. No morality alone makes moral. Every ethic that affirms itself kills off too much strength and costs humanity too dearly. Those who deviate from morality are the most inventive and fruitful ones, and they should no longer be sacrificed to the needs of the herd. Nietzsche says these aims should be recognized and promoted by all who are honest and seek truth. A common misconception is that Nietzsche wants to destroy this morality, but actually he says he only wants to stop its tyranny. My philosophy aims at an ordering of rank, not an individualistic morality. The ideas of the herd should rule in the herd, but not reach out beyond it. The leaders of the herd require a fundamentally different valuation for their own actions, as do the independent or the beasts of prey, etc. Since society's values no longer want to preserve, a new experiment must be attempted according to Nietzsche. This new experiment will be in the form of individuals creating their own values. Such a spirit who has become free stands amid the cosmos with a joyous and trusting fatalism, in the faith that only the particular is loathsome, and that all is redeemed and affirmed in the whole. He does not negate any more. Such a faith, however, is the highest of all possible faiths. I have baptized it with the name of Dionysus. Virtues are as dangerous as vices, if we let them roll over us as external authorities and laws, instead of producing them from within ourselves. Whether through self-defense or necessity, our values should promote our own growth and existence, which we acknowledge independently of whether others go with us in similar conditions. Nietzsche criticizes the idea of one united good humanity. This would be nothing more than conformity, and would take away anything good about virtue. Instead, virtue is a distinguishing characteristic, and should be developed precisely for the purpose of distinguishing oneself from others.